Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for this very special webinar with the Victorian Treasurer, Tim Pallas. I'm Paul Guerra, Chief Executive of VECI, and it's great to have you all here today. For many of us, running businesses in a vibrant and diverse economy like Victoria has been challenging and rewarding, but never as challenging as the circumstances that we find ourselves in today. The Victorian Government, led by Premier Daniel Andrews, should be congratulated for implementing the many initiatives to help us survive this period, and naturally we are looking to them for guidance as we navigate through the crisis and of course across to the other side. In conjunction with Small Business Victoria, we've now been running these webinars for around 6 weeks, and today we get the privileged opportunity to hear from the architect behind the business initiatives, our Treasurer, Tim Pallas. Don't forget, you can go to www.business.vic.gov.au to access advice and business grants, the many business grants that are available from the state government. Also, don't forget, you can help us all get back to business safely and sooner by downloading the COVID Safe app. So please, if you haven't already done so, now might be a good time to do it. Just before we start our chat with the Treasurer, don't forget you can submit your questions, and if we get time, I will ask the Treasurer on your behalf. And all of the questions and appropriate answers will be posted on the Victorian Chamber website, along with a recording of today's webinars. What a time to be Treasurer of Victoria. But aren't we so fortunate to have Tim Pallas, with all his experience and years of expertise to guide us through. In my time with the Victorian Chamber, I found the Treasurer to be both approachable and genuinely interested in what businesses in this state needs to grow and thrive, and hence the reason why he was so strong with his survival packages. That Victoria was in a strong position going into the COVID pandemic was in a large part due to the great work of the Treasurer, and it's my pleasure to introduce him today. Treasurer Tim Pallas, good morning.
Well, thanks very much, Paul, and thanks for that warm welcome. And I also want to thank the Victorian Chamber for their continued support, their advice and their advocacy for matters relating to their membership and the broader business community. It's vitally important that we hear the views and concerns of your membership. We can't adapt and adjust our strategies without an insight into the impact it's having on your members. So I do really want to thank you quite genuinely and quite warmly for your counsel and your continued advice through this period. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting severally and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Now, it's an overused word at the moment that these really are unprecedented times for all of us. 6 months ago, no one could have foreseen coronavirus and its impacts on the community, or for that matter, our economy. Thanks to the efforts of Victorians, we have forced the curve down. There's no doubt about that. We're proud of the gutsy, can-do spirit we've seen from Victorians, the discipline and the compassion for others. It really is a gratifying experience. Nobody would wish these hard times that we're encountering, or indeed the hard times to come. And believe me, they will be hard times to come. Nobody could have wished for them, but it does demonstrate the character of the community that we have, that people have so effectively found a way not only to comply with our social distancing rules, but look out for each other. Securing the health and the safety of our community has been our primary objective. Our job now is to build the economic bridge that will help Victorian businesses and households get to the other side of this crisis and be ready to recover. By now, you've heard all the predictions. You know that we're in for the sort of economic challenge that will be talked about for decades to come. This is a generation-defining event, make no mistake, and one we probably haven't seen the likes of since the early 19th century. 20th century rather. We know our economy is going to get worse before it gets better. We released Treasury forecasts 2 weeks ago that paint a pretty grim picture for both the June and the September quarters. Economic activity is expected to be 14% lower than it would have been without coronavirus. For the 2020 calendar year, that means a 6.75% fall in gross state product. That's broadly consistent, perhaps a little bit more pessimistic than the Australian government and the IMF projections, largely because they are national projections and we're projecting the impact upon our state economy and its special circumstances. But we also know that we're well placed to survive this crisis. Victoria came into this with an economy that was the envy of the nation, with 5 years of above trend economic growth and more new jobs than any other state or territory. This, of course, has put us in a very strong position. And of course, our entrepreneurial, hardworking business sector has been a huge part of Victoria's success to date, and it will play a key role in our successes to come. And make no mistake, there will be successes. So we look forward to continuing our working partnership as we move through this extraordinary, historic and challenging time. The Treasury forecasts also showed that we could see some 270,000 jobs lost, with unemployment peaking as high as 11% in the September quarter, more than double the rate going into the crisis. That's why we've acted hard and fast by providing much needed support to businesses and individuals. In this environment, we need to do everything in our power to help businesses survive and to fight for every single Victorian job. We're seeing very positive signs on flattening the curve and controlling the health crisis. This will not only save lives, it is the key to getting economic activity going again. Some point to Sweden's decision not to impose lockdowns as a way to save jobs and livelihoods. But their own central bank is projecting an economic contraction just as severe as its European neighbours, but with a more severe loss of life. This is not a choice between saving lives or saving the economy. I want to make that clear. We have to do both. We've been working closely with the Commonwealth throughout this crisis to do just that. And I suppose it's not would not take people by surprise to realise that there are nuanced differences between how we approach these issues, what our lockdown arrangements are, and how we phase out of those lockdown arrangements. But putting all of that to one side, we've seen a level of bipartisanship that this country hasn't seen since a wartime context. And it's vitally important that we keep those areas of consistency of approach and complementarity of action that will be vital to giving clear messages to the community and keeping politics out of the equation for as long as we possibly can. We welcome the Commonwealth's Job Seeker program as a vital measure to provide support to struggling businesses and to their workers, and just as importantly, to keep those businesses and workers connected. Our measures have been designed really to complement the Commonwealth's efforts. We're also committed to providing the support needed to cushion the impacts of coronavirus on the Victorian economy. The Victorian government is currently spending about $1 billion a week more than would constitute normal spending, despite our revenue having fallen quite significantly. So because we're not going to drive the economy down even further by pursuing the politics of austerity. Now that makes a treasurer such as myself, who's prided himself on managing debt levels appropriately and also providing very substantial surpluses, the highest average surpluses a state has ever seen, a little nervous. But I tell you, the greatest disservice we can do to the economy is to effectively pull back and deny the community the support and the assistance that they need at this time. A key example, of course, of this is our $1.7 billion economic survival package, supporting workers and businesses hit hardest by the virus. As part of this package, more than $470 million in payroll tax refunds have been paid out to over 18,000 small and medium-sized businesses, providing cash in the bank when those businesses need it most. And their payroll tax will be waived for the remainder of the financial year. Yesterday, I announced that we'll provide further payroll tax relief by exempting JobKeeper payments to workers that aren't working or payments above what they otherwise would get. Now, these exemptions will also apply to work cover premiums. We want to support businesses that are doing the right thing, passing through JobKeeper payments to their eligible employees, including those who've been stood down. Our economic support package has also included the $500 million Business Support Fund, designed in consultation with the Victorian Chamber. Now, the fund provides about $10,000 grants to small employers that don't pay payroll tax. The initial phase of the fund was directed at businesses in the hardest hit sectors that were directly affected or severely impacted by the shutdowns ordered to protect public health and save lives. The criteria has been now expanded to include small employers who are participating in the Commonwealth's JobKeeper program, regardless of the sector that they operate in. The package has also seen more than 2,700 people back in jobs, thanks to the government's Working for Victoria Fund, more than $2 billion in accelerated payments to our suppliers, rent waived for commercial tenants in government premises. We know that rent's one of the biggest costs facing many businesses. That's why, as part of the $500 million tenancies package, the government's provided further support for small and medium businesses through the Commercial Tenancy Relief Scheme. Consistent with the principles of the National Cabinet, this provides a 6-month moratorium on evictions, and it allows businesses to negotiate rental waivers or deferrals with their landlords relative to their lost income. All told, this represents more than $3 billion of support to Victorian businesses, workers, and the community. Just like our approach to surviving the immediate crisis, we're listening to the advice from the business sector and workers so that we can get the best bang for every buck we spend rebuilding the economy. We know that governments and businesses will need to invest in rebuilding the economy following unprecedented workplace disruptions and impacts on global and domestic supply chains. At a special sitting of Parliament last month, we locked in $8 billion worth of funding for infrastructure projects underway in 2021. And additionally, we established a $24.5 billion line of credit for emergency funding, which will allow us to save jobs and set the state up to recover from the pandemic over the next 2 years. We also know that private capital is willing and ready to invest in Victoria, one of the world's most livable cities, and we want to streamline that. That's why we've set up a dedicated task force to investigate planning and investment opportunities to boost our building and development industry. This task force will fast track new investments and it will deliver projects more efficiently. And Victoria is well placed to capitalise on these opportunities. I want to pay particular recognition and regard to Planning Minister Richard Wynne, who has so constructively engaged with the requests that I've made of him, that the Premier's made of him, that we need to find ways to unlock opportunity so that we can get Victoria back to work and particularly lead the way with our building and construction sector. Victoria, of course, was ranked first of all the states and territories for 8 straight quarters in the CommSec State of the States, consistently leading the nation on economic growth, construction activity and jobs. Because of our strong fiscal management, we started from a solid financial position, and our AAA credit rating means that we can borrow responsibly to support the recovery. Can I say for this financial year, I've been able to raise whatever funds the state needs in order to keep its operations running and running efficiently and be in a position to deal with the needs of the economy and the community going forward, which is a clear demonstration that whatever liquidity problems may be encountered, the Victorian economy, the Victorian government is held in very high regard in the bond markets right around the world. A key contributor to our strong economic position going into this crisis was our immense investment in infrastructure, which we started as soon as we came to government. Our Big Build agenda helped create more than 115,000 jobs, one of the reasons Victoria led the nation in jobs growth before coronavirus. This pipeline of projects has laid the foundation for our state's future, and it leaves us in a strong position to be ready for the economic upswing ahead. And believe me, it will come. We're continuing our procurement in key projects while remaining agile in our approach so that we can respond to coronavirus impacts. Projects like our level crossing removal program, the Metro Tunnel, Westgate Tunnel, the North East Link remain crucial to our future. This government remains committed to these projects. They are vital, and to the extent that we can facilitate, support and deliver them, we will continue to do that with full gusto. These projects are continuing apace. They're giving thousands of workers a steady income, as well as contributing to Victoria's economic activity. There's no doubt that this pandemic is a challenge of our generation, but Victoria is well placed to face it, with years of nation building growth and prosperity behind us. We don't just want to get back to where we were. We want to build for the future, and we need to learn the lessons of the past and be advised by the changes that are happening around us, both in terms of how our communities interact and the economic opportunities it will present. We're planning to be in the best position for the economic upswing ahead and to be ready to take every opportunity that presents itself. We know that you stand with us shoulder to shoulder as we get on with the job of rebuilding Victoria. I want to thank you. I want to thank you for your courage and your support in what are very, very difficult times. And I look forward to continuing our partnership as we strive to make sure that Victoria gets stronger and better together. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Treasurer. I love the sentiment, and I can tell you the questions that we're receiving in online shows the interest that's out there. So what I might do is I might talk a little bit and just understand the insights that you went through inside the workings of a government. I might ask you a question about recovery. Then I might ask you a question around the future, some of which you've covered in your dialogue just then, which was fabulous to get the insights. And then we'll hand it over for questions from the audience. The first one, just looking inside the government, you have the privilege of doing that. Help us understand how you went about implementing the response. What did you assess, what was needed, and how did you come up with the measures that you took to work through those complexities?
Well, I think it's fair to say, Paul, that nobody's written a rule book or a guide for an event of this nature. In many ways, the level of economic impact that we're looking at is unprecedented. I told the Melbourne Chamber that we've seen about a 3% downturn in consumer spending at the height, or at the onset rather, of the early 1990s recession. We're seeing something like 20% reduction. And a lot of that is essentially policy driven. The state saying we need to social distance, and that has an impact upon the way that business operates. We all want to get back as soon as we can to a fully functioning economy, but I fear that it will still be some time to come before we get there. What the government did when the Premier decided he was going to establish the Crisis Committee of Cabinet was he wanted to centralise decision making within government, but he also didn't want to distract the rest of the ministry who have ongoing and continuing responsibilities to make sure that the day-to-day business of government was still being attended to. So the Crisis Committee of Cabinet effectively is looking at two things. How do we help the community through the existing event as it's unfolding? What sort of interventions and investments do we need to make to ensure that we're increasing government services where the need arises, and obviously most notably in the health area? But what are we also doing in terms of providing the support to the community and the business community in particular to ensure that the fundamental strength of our community and the architecture of our economy is being adequately preserved, and therefore in a strong position for an economic upturn when the circumstances present? And finally, what we're doing is spending a lot of time thinking about what is a post-COVID economy going to look like. There will be changes, I think that's clear. Where are the opportunities? Where are the challenges that will confront the state going forward? Recognising that we're probably likely to see international borders constrained in terms of their porous nature for some time to come, probably until we get a vaccine for this virus. So how we get our intra-state economic activity operating, how we open up state borders, recognising that Victoria is the only state that hasn't actually shut its state borders. New South Wales, I should say. But importantly, we need to recognise that the changes that we make now, the choices that we make now, could well set Victorians up for a much more prosperous future than if we simply focus on the challenge of the moment and not the opportunity of the future.
So as I start to look then into recovery, and we're starting to get this question quite a bit around the JobKeeper payments, which you addressed earlier, and some of the other initiatives which are set to finish end of September, early October. Some businesses haven't been able to pivot into different areas, and as we know, some businesses have done what the government's asked to say, well, actually hibernate for now if you can and start getting ready to come back. There is a concern around what 1 October or thereabouts looks like, and businesses saying to us it'd be great if there was a timeline around what does the road out of recovery look like. Are you able to give any commentary around that?
Well, certainly. I think so far as the JobKeeper arrangements are, we've been very complimentary of the Commonwealth for the work that they've done around JobKeeper and JobSeeker. Look, to be honest, from a nuance point of view, there would be some differences in approach that we would have adopted, and they'd really go to how casuals are managed and exactly the scope of the application of JobKeeper, international, foreign-owned companies, national government-owned companies, how we might deal with questions associated with length of casual employment and accessibility to the scheme. All of those things aside, this is a very substantial contribution of something in the order of magnitude of 10% of GDP that's been directed amongst the JobKeeper program and the various other iterations of investment that the Commonwealth has made. So we've tried as best we can to complement the work that the Commonwealth has done. We've tried to make sure that the schemes and the processes that we've put in place have sought to utilise the criteria that the Commonwealth has identified, and where there are shortcomings, try to fill the gap as best we can, recognising that our budgets and our capacity are finite. But I think that it's clear that if we don't preserve the economic architecture of the state as best we can, then the upswing will be that much harder. So certainly our number one priority is fighting the pandemic event and recognising that when we get through that event, we will have opportunities and we will have choices about how we can wind back social distancing and how we can make sure that we preserve sufficient of the economy that we can move quickly to re-establish our economic health and well-being. So continuing to work with industry around what interventions are best made and where essentially we need to be present in terms of assisting them, not only in a financial sense, but in a policy sense. What are the reforms that people think are vitally important? We've changed our behaviours because of this event. What are the changed behaviours that we need to put in place in order to capitalise on opportunities? You'll see the congestion on our roads is appreciably less. Yeah. What can we do to ensure that some of the changed habits, the working from home opportunities, are better utilised going forward? Now, the timeline for recovery, I think, is a much more complex question and quite frankly comes down to the fact that we don't control the virus or its presentations. But I think the efforts that we've done in being able to lock down the numbers, identify clusters and track them and match them effectively has put us in a strong position where we can have confidence that we will be seeing in the near future moderation of some of those social distancing rules. But make no mistake, social distancing will be around for quite some time to come in some form or other.
So I want to pick up that sentiment around the future, and the reality is, Treasurer, there is no vaccine for the virus yet. So we're going to be operating for a period of time where there is no vaccine, no cure, aside from keeping the virus at bay through social distancing. But as we move into the future, through your lens, what will be the primary concern to kickstart the rebuild of the economy? I'll probably put you on the spot a little bit around what sort of measures might be on the table that you're already thinking through.
Yeah, well, I can tell you what I can tell you, Paul, and I'll be as cryptic as I can when I can't. But our focus first and foremost is about helping as many businesses as possible survive the crisis and stay connected with their workforce. So this is not just about easing pain in the short term, it's also about helping kickstart the economic recovery on the other side. It's also, I think, much easier for established businesses with existing workers to ramp up than it will be for new businesses to start from scratch. I talked about this in my presentation, that one key area of focus will be the development and around improving our construction and building industries, which is why we formed the Building Victoria's Recovery Task Force that Minister Wynne and I are working very closely with at the moment. They'll have the task of looking at ways that we can improve planning and what stimulus we may be able to utilise to help so that our building industry is ready to fire on all cylinders. Government will also have an important role to play as a driver of investment and economic activity. As I mentioned in the presentation, we expect to continue and in fact step up in the investment in infrastructure. We're also considering a range of possibilities to drive the economy: a training and skill blitz, a kindergarten and school construction bonanza, supporting the rollout of 3-year-old kinder, reviving Victoria's nation-leading tourism and major event stocks, one of the industries that's clearly been hardest hit by the onset of the pandemic, more partnerships with the private sector, local governments, industry super funds on projects that create jobs and stimulate the economy and can get going as soon as possible. So that's sort of a taste of the areas that we're looking at the moment, Paul.
Thank you. And our members are really keen to work with the state for how Victoria can leapfrog the other states and in fact nations, because I do think we came into this ahead of the other states. We want to come out of it ahead of the other states. But importantly, as we start to look about the future, how does Victoria position itself on a global scale and pick up some international expertise? Fascinating to hear the insights, and I can tell you the questions we're over 50 at the moment. We won't get to them all, I know that, but let's make an attempt to get to some of them. And the first question, Graham Kelly from Gen U. Graham.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you, Treasurer. Our business is a national, excuse me, our business is a national business and impacted by the varying levels of government requirements. Excuse me. What role will Victoria take at National Cabinet, and what will it be its position in relation to the easing of physical restrictions, as well as the differing rules around education, particularly schools?
Well, I think, and thanks very much, Graham, for the question. The National Cabinet's been a very successful institution. In many ways, what it does is it recognises that the responsibility for managing the way that our communities operate is essentially the state's responsibility. But the Commonwealth, of course, has a vital role to play in terms of consistency, resourcing, and of course, the revitalisation of our economy through productivity supports, recognising, of course, that our international borders are their responsibilities. So the level of cooperation between the governments around the country, I think, has to be commended. And I believe it's provided reassurance to the Australian public. I think far too often we get very excited about the nuanced differences that occur between governments as opposed to the enormous level of comparability and unanimity of approach that's been adopted. And by and large, those problems have been worked through an open dialogue, sometimes through robust debate. But nonetheless, it's worked. And perhaps it tells us about a roadmap for the future, about respect, about politics playing a secondary role, about recognising that we all have a collective responsibility to our respective constituencies and states, but ultimately we're all Australians. So it's that strength that I think has led us to the position we're in today. And there are many countries around the world that would simply be envious of the choices that are opening up for the country at the moment because of our hard work together. So speaking for myself, look, I'm in regular contact with the treasurers from all the other states and territories, and the Commonwealth Treasurer, who sent me a note today telling me he'd said nice things about me on radio. So I then privately said nice things back to him. So you can see that there's this general regard that's being reflected by the shared challenges that we confront. So we're in the business now of sharing ideas. No state is being greedy about coming up with a good idea and trying to keep it to itself. We're sharing them. I chair the Board of Treasurers, which is all the states and territories sitting around talking about the things that they need to do. We're meeting on a 1 to 2 times a week basis. We're meeting with the Commonwealth Treasurer through the CFFR, the Committee for Financial Relations, with the Commonwealth Treasurer involved. So that sharing of ideas, I think, is critically important. Of course, when it comes to the easing of physical restrictions, it's the Premier and the other First Ministers at a 10 national cabinet that'll make a call on the easing of restrictions, and ultimately will be guided by the health advice. I just want to be clear about this. There's no malice in terms of the fact that this state has a different view, but we've looked at the science and we take a view that the Chief Health Officer is acting in a considered and conscientious way, and we've got to respect the advice he's given. The Prime Minister was quite clear when he said, if you live in Victoria, listen to the Victorian Premier, and the Victorian Premier's been listening to the advice of the Chief Health Officer. That's as it should be. That will dictate how we deal not only with schools, but the broader social distancing issues. But can I make a final point, Graham? Nobody is enjoying the restrictions on our liberty that social distancing puts in place. Nobody could have wished this upon our economy or our community or on the health of so many people in our society. But what we have demonstrated is that we can work together to come up with solutions. I'm absolutely convinced that that's what will occur through these processes.
Great, thanks, Treasurer. Thanks, Graham. We came into this with global renown, in our opinion, for events, cafes, restaurants, and congresses. We've got to make sure we come out of this and reclaim that through this process. And someone that sits at the heart of all that is Julia Swanson from the Melbourne Convention Bureau.
Thank you, Paul, and hello, Treasurer. You've spoken a lot about infrastructure today, and we're just keen to hear your thoughts on other sectors that will have a strong impact in that economic recovery.
Certainly. Well, look, the economic recovery is going to take a real Team Victoria approach. There's no doubt about it. We'll need to rely on significant effort from all levels of government, businesses, our institutions, and of course our community. Like any team environment, successfully overcoming our challenges will depend on how we access those varieties of our strengths. So industry sectors will play different roles in our economic recovery. A strong recovery, I think, will depend on the sectors that have been hardest hit, like hospitality, tourism, international education, major events, springing back to life as rapidly as possible. And we recognise that the state is going to have to play a role in assisting you doing that. Businesses in these sectors, we know, have been doing it tough. They might feel like injured players coming back off the bench, nervous about getting back into the game. But, you know, we're going to coach you and we're going to support you in that process. But supporting business to get back to being themselves and being the best that they can be also means that when the restrictions are eased, Victorians will continue to show them support. And that means that the government has to continue to extol the virtues and strengths of these sectors and what a vital role they play, both in employment but overall well-being for the economy. So a strong recovery will rely on emerging and high-growth sectors, continuing to innovate and market new ideas, products and services. So high-tech, professional, financial services, agri-food, renewable energy, for example, are all sectors that create the kind of high-value jobs needed to secure high living standards for Victorians for years to come. But of course, we need a reliable on-baller and recovery will depend on a strong and steady pipeline of building and construction projects right across the Victorian playing field. We know that 1 in 10 jobs in Victoria is in the building and construction industry, and in many ways we've softened the blow of the downturn in the economy by being able to keep that industry functioning, although I understand under very difficult circumstances. So finally, a strong recovery will depend on these sectors that'll need to continue to defend Victoria against the virus. That is, we will need to recognise that the performance of Victoria's health and community services sector will be a strong contributor both to the pandemic event, but also to supporting economic growth going forward. As we know, our health services sector has been one of the fastest growing sectors when it comes to employment in the years leading up to the pandemic event. So our local manufacturing sector is also going to have to play a critical role to managing future outbreaks through the provision of PPE, testing, medical technology and equipment. It'll be tough and it'll take longer than we'd like, but I'm confident that we're going to have what it takes to recover well ahead of our global competitors.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks, Treasurer. And one last question before I hand over to Anne to pick up some questions from the audience. But one of our significant manufacturers, another with worldwide renown, is Bombardier. And Wendy McMillan has a question for you, Treasurer.
Thanks, Paul. Treasurer, again, congratulations on the response thus far. And from a manufacturing and transport services perspective, Treasurer, your government has a progressive policy suite, unheralded really, elsewhere for supporting local business in actioning more contracts with localisation and content. Would you and the government consider prioritising more of these projects to be approved potentially before the October budget? The projects could therefore be monitored through the Jobs Commissioner and justified through the multiplier impacts, which are significant through the local SMEs and supply chains. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Wendy. Look, obviously, we've got a very strong track record in supporting local jobs and local job content. Our policies are very much focused on it. The fact that we've seen a resurgent rolling stock industry in this state is testament to that. But it's also, I think, a clear demonstration that as a government, we do put a priority in supporting local jobs. As you've probably already seen, we certainly haven't been waiting for the October budget to announce policy interventions in a range of areas. They've tended to be, Wendy, in the area of business survival and community survival to try and dull the sharper edges of the economic downturn. But we are now focusing our minds on what we can and should be doing in order to assist the economy take the full opportunity of an economic upswing. And it will be a substantial upswing. I'm seeing it more as a tick, that is a sharp fall and then a moderate but consistent improvement in our circumstances. I don't see it as being a V-shaped recovery. I have to be clear. So we're looking at how we can support local companies and we can rebuild local supply chains, and that'll include how we can use our procurement policies to better effect. We certainly won't be waiting until the October budget to do more. Yes, there will be some things that we can do in the short and medium term leading into October's budget. I don't consider myself constrained by interventions simply because we hold them up or save them up for a budget in October or November, whenever that might be. But I can tell you that making those interventions, we'll want to be convinced that we get very quick investment and activity that will generate jobs and will get the activity that we're funding underway as quickly as possible. So funding, for example, infrastructure works that might take 5 years to get going are not really of much interest to us at the moment. We're looking for those small and medium-sized interventions that will see work underway as quickly as possible, and that'll be our focus between now and the October budget. We'll also be making an effort to ensure that we leverage our capacity as best we can, whether it's to seek increased investment from the Commonwealth, dollar for dollar or more dollars from the Commonwealth than that. I still live in hope. And secondly, is the opportunity for us to start working with business and start to talk about how our public-private partnerships regime can bring more investment from business, how identified investments from the state might get local government more focused on making investments, whether it be on infrastructure or indeed local services and social infrastructure in their communities. So we're very much focused that the post-pandemic world will be different. The requirement for supply chain security, local manufacturing, I think will become more pronounced, at least in those areas that are seen as critical to maintaining the community's well-being. I see this as a watershed event. I think that people are now starting to think very seriously about what are the things that we need to do domestically that we haven't done sufficient justice to, and what's the premium that we're prepared to pay for that domestic manufactured and provided good and service. So we'll be doing more in this space. I think it is a vindication of our procurement strategies to date, but it will mean we'll have to do more going forward.
Wonderful. Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Treasurer. And I think we've probably got time for one question, maybe two. I know the Treasurer's got a deadline to meet, another meeting to go into, but I'll introduce Anne Wright, our Head of Media and Comms, to ask some of the questions that have been coming through, Treasurer. Anne.
Thank you. Wayne McCoy got in early with this one. What is normal likely to look like, and what type of businesses are likely to return to normal first?
Well, I don't think we'll ever go back to where we were, is my view, Anne. I mean, there will just be changes, learnings that will have come out of this event. We'll have a much better connectedness through the systems that we put in place, some of which have surprised us. But certainly normal in terms of the continued operation of our economy will look substantially different in the short term. Until there's a vaccine for the virus, I don't expect to see a lot of people-to-people contact internationally occurring. And that will have an impact upon a lot of our domestic tourism operators. It will have an impact upon our hospitality and our hotel industries. So we will see, I think, a lot more of internal self-sufficiency and activity in the short term. We will also have to be recognising that governments are going to have to play, whether they like it or not, whether it sits ideologically comfortably with their predispositions, are going to have to play a much more active role in assisting the community and the economy to repair. Certainly from my perspective, I suspect being able to form key partnerships with industry, identifying those areas of growth in the economy, will help us get back to a level of economic growth that will be valuable. Recognising that the World Bank assesses that there are only two economies in our local region that will not be affected by an economic downturn, a recession, is both China and India. Our trade arrangements with those countries will be vitally important, but importantly, we're going to need to recognise that our service provision will look different in terms of its provision internationally, and of course our trade in commodities will be an increasing focus of our international acquired wealth going forward.
Thanks, Treasurer. And I'm just conscious of time, so we might leave it there. And all questions we'll answer and have them on the website for people to access. Treasurer, thanks. It's been amazing how much territory we've covered in the 45 minutes. And for everybody online, to access the grants that the Treasurer talked about, go to www.business.vic.gov.au. There's all sorts of advice there as well. And also victorianchamber.com.au for all the advice you need there. The Treasurer talked a lot today about recovery. We think a fundamental part of recovery will be to ensure that once we start, we don't stop again. And we've developed a COVID restarting the workplace. There's a checklist there. There's also a full guide for workplaces there, and we'd encourage everybody to head to the www.victorianchamber.com.au website to do that. Finally, I'd like to introduce the Victorian Chamber President, Karen Sobels, to conclude what's been a fantastic and informative conversation. Karen.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you, Treasurer, for coming on today. We've had over 1,000 people on this conference today, which is just fantastic, and it's just a continuing example of how you do continue to engage with us in terms of, you talk about being in the business of sharing ideas, and that's what we've been doing. I recall at the start of the year, we were talking about how we were stretched trying to deal with the bushfires. And we're in a whole different environment now. And what that shows is we just need to be able to deal with change. We need to think differently. And there was a question before about what is normal. Nobody knows what normal is yet. We have to build normal, and we encourage all of our members to continue to come back to us with ideas, questions, suggestions on how we can work together to continue to adapt to that change. And I know that today is the day actually that you're in our diaries to do our annual budget lunch. Sorry about the food, we couldn't provide that. We might have to catch up with that a little later, maybe in October. But normally you'd set your budget for a year and we'd all sort of, question, criticise and go off and, perform for a year. But nobody knows what this looks like, and so even as early as as yesterday and today, you've made even more changes to help in terms of JobKeeper and payroll tax, etc. So we all need to be aware of that nothing's set in stone, that we all need to continue working together and work harder to be part of the solution and not just the problem. You talked about learning lessons from the past. We can make some analogies to the past, but none of us have been here before. So we all have to be a bit creative. We have to be a bit more collaborative. And I think we have done really well, whether it's no matter what political persuasion somebody's from, whether it's state or whether it's federal. I think everyone's worked incredibly well together and across businesses as well. And we've had some of these webinars showing some of our businesses like Four Pillars Gin who've done some incredible pivots in their business to adapt. So with bringing all of those things together, whether it's change, whether it's what the roadmap needs to be, the biggest part of that is communication and sharing ideas. And we thank you for continuing to be part of our business communication, and we pledge to keep coming back to you and helping you do your job as well. So thank you for your time. I know you have a crisis cabinet meeting on. I do question whether or not there's ever such a thing as a non-crisis cabinet meeting at the moment, but wish you all the best and thank you for joining us today.
My great pleasure, and thanks very much for all the great work the Victorian Chamber does. Sorry I couldn't get to all the questions, Karen, and I'm sure that we'll try and work with the Chamber to get those answers together for those who feel a little frustrated that perhaps a politician spent too long talking in response to the few questions he got to. Thanks very much, folks.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day. Bye for now.